Cyberpunk has been a game I've seriously enjoyed, and that I've put an unhealthy amount of time into. Finishing it on the 14th? Well, it went past midnight, so I suppose it's actually the 15th. But one thing I really couldn't shake was the emptiness of the endings. This video is going to contain massive spoilers for the Cyberpunk 2077 endings, and I'm also going to mention the Witcher 3 endings and a little bit about Soma, Spec Ops: The Line, and the Talos Principle. So here's your warning in advance if you want to go into those completely blind. And I'm really curious what other people thought about the endings and if they had similar experiences to me. I don't see a lot of discussion about them, so I'm really assuming that a lot of people are still playing through the game. It is pretty long and there's a lot you can do. I'm also only trying to focus on the possible endings, not the build-up or any of the major side missions. If I talk about the entire game, this is going to be a long video, and I'm also assuming that you know what all the endings are. My friends and I were all huge fans of the Witcher series. A lot of us read the books when they were finally translated, and almost all of us got into the games before the release of The Witcher 3. The thing that really struck out to me about The Witcher 3's endings was the conversations that it spawned between all of us. We were really invested in the world, and we had tons of debates over which was the best ending, about how horrific it was to make Temeria a vassal state and let the North fall, but that Ciri as an empress would take a much fairer rule and hopefully, equalize and make things better for everyone. So the fall of the North is justified, or talking about how Emir is an awful father and that Ciri's better off being free, and how that plays into the fall of the North. Even just conversations about fairly typical stuff like whether you chose Yen, Triss, or neither. The endings were dramatically different and really ripe for arguments on what the best course of action was. Is it detestable to make Ciri a Witcher if we let the North fall and have Emir in charge? Is letting Roach die a fair cost for stopping Nilfgaardian conquest? Conversations like that and all those points came up a lot. They occurred organically and with passion. Even all these years later, it's a story and conclusion my friends and I bring up when we talk about other stories. It has a lasting effect. And that game came out over half a decade ago now. Really, because of those games and stories, all my friends were huge CD Projekt Red fans, huge fans of the Witcher games, and as I mentioned, we always discuss the games afterwards, the endings we get, and why we choose specific things. And that doesn't just apply to the Witcher series, we really talk about games a lot. Honestly, instead of having a book club, we have a game club, I guess. With Cyberpunk, we all played it, but the ending just sort of felt empty. Regardless of what you do, you end up with the conclusion of dying after 6 months or digitizing yourself. That's a choice you get. But even when it came to that choice, really all my friends just kind of dismissed the digitized endings anyway. They dismissed it as dying. And honestly, I kind of find it hard to disagree with them. If you digitize yourself, it's just pure blackness, and in those endings where you digitize yourself, you play as Silverhand, not V. So it just feels over. Not to mention that Alt literally says she isn't Alt after being digitized and calling the method Soul Killer. It just feels like it kills a lot of the debate over whether it's you or not. There isn't any optimism or much up to interpretation of how you'll fare, who you are. And really, the big reason I'm making this video is because I didn't really have any discussion with my friends about this game's ending. We talked about it for like 3-4 minutes, and then we stopped talking about the conclusion. Like, we all put a crazy amount of time into this game, a ridiculous amount of hours. We messed up our sleep schedules. We finished it in less than a week, did all the major side missions and main missions, but our discussions about the ending just kind of dissolved into, yeah, V dies no matter what you do. Kind of sad. Trying to bring up nuance about the secure your soul working out and you getting your body back tends to just end with Arasaka doesn't really care about you, plus digitization is probably just dying anyway, it's not really you. And all the options just feel really hollow. We didn't have impassioned discussions like we did with the Witcher endings. It's just always, yeah, you die, I guess. Games I've played that I thought really did the concept of digitizing yourself and playing with the question of what does it mean to have a soul were Soma and the Talos Principle. These are games that, again, are years old now, but my friends and I still discuss and mention because of how intense and provoking their stories are. They really left a lasting impression and honestly made me ask a lot of questions. They were contemplative and played with this theme so well, and they were both tiny indie games. Cyberpunk's ending never really did this to me, or any of my friends who have dramatically different views and tastes in stories than me. Like I said, we argue all the time over other games. Honestly, in comparison to these games, and even just the Witcher series, a lot of the Cyberpunk endings writing just kind of feels amateurish. And that's really why I'm making this video. My friends and I dumped tons of hours into the game, did all the major side missions and main story, but none of the conclusions really spawned anything huge or passionate for us. Unlike games like The Witcher 3, Soma, Spec Ops The Line, the Talos Principle, which we still bring up today, Cyberpunk's conclusion just didn't offer much that was thought-provoking, and I think that it's kind of sad. I don't really think it's an ending we'll ever really bring up again. We all just sort of dismissed it. And it's very easy to just dismiss. I really crave that interaction and discussion with my friends. Like I said, instead of a book club, we have a game club. But this game really didn't give us that. We definitely talked tons about the build-up to the missions and who we decided to call and why, but again, I'm trying to just focus on the endings. The 6-month endings also really felt strange. The whole premise of the game and motivation for V's character was that he had a few weeks to live, so he goes to absolute extremes for self-preservation. The entire journey, the insane measures you take, the people you kill, all for the hope of living. You're suicidal because your only other choice is death. It's really intense, and some of the things you do are barbaric and insane. You're a man, or woman, with nothing to lose. Yet, once he finds out he's on limited time again, just like the start of the game, he just accepts death? I guess we could get into the concept of Night City breaking V, like it did Judy, but it really felt bizarre to me. The whole game was about this. It would be like Geralt doing every single part of The Witcher 3 to find Ciri, but at the end, Ciri is teleported to a different place instead of the regular ending happening, and Geralt ends up in the same position he started in. Would Geralt just give up on finding Ciri because he already did it once? I don't want to call these endings bad because I don't think they're outright awful or anything, but this does kind of feel like poor writing. The main character's motivation is just not really consistent. I suppose we could talk about Johnny overwriting your mind and making you not care about your life as much, but you're not like that at the end. You do all these insane things at the end. And I'm really not sure why exactly they feel so incredibly empty. Why they didn't spawn any discussions with my friends and I, and why they're so easy to dismiss. Like I said, a lot of it all just feels like dying. You know, even the digitization endings. You just pick your poison. Maybe if you had a choice to survive, not die in 6 months, but have lasting effects and questions on whether you're still V, have some nuance that people could really debate on. Or maybe it feels this way because the endings are not really the result of what you did. You pick your ending with a dialogue wheel. The ending isn't a product of your actions. Granted, there are different missions and dialogue that opens up depending what you did, but again, no matter what you choose, you end up with the choice of being digitized or dying in 6 months. Even if you down omega blockers like there's no tomorrow, V is still too far overwritten by Johnny. So those early decisions about the pills really don't do anything. I did think it was interesting how they went about the game. The whole idea is that at the start you're told you're gonna die when you weren't really attached to V or the world at all, and then you spend the whole game getting attached to V and the people of this world only to find out that regardless of what you do, you're still dead. It's a really depressing concept and really reminded me of how dark the main story is. There's not a lot of reprieve or wind down, unlike, say, The Witcher 3, which had the drinking scene with Geralt and the boys stealing Yen's underwear. That was hilarious. Heart of Stone 2 was an amazing mix of darkness, comedy, and just a lot of emotions. Actually, all my friends and I really agreed The Witcher had a better grasp on humor overall. Cyberpunk's main story is just sort of depressing, no matter what, which I don't think is necessarily bad. You can do a lot with an unrelenting sad story. And I do think that crushing dark endings could be powerful, but for me, it still just falls flat in Cyberpunk. When I think of these ultra-depressing, sad games that did that no matter what you do, this will end badly theme well, I think of something like Spec Ops: The Line. That game really got to me, and it had such incredible subtleties about just slowly losing it. The way tooltips would change, executions would get more and more graphic, your character would get mangled, the visuals would get worse and worse. The game set you up to do horrible things if you were really getting pissed off and angry at it too, like shooting into the crowd surrounding Lugos when you could shoot into the air among other options. That game really made me think, and again, it's a very old game still having its ending discussed today. It hit home for a lot of people, and its conclusion had a lot of hard questions to answer. I discussed that game tons with my friends, and we all thought it was really incredible. Story-wise, at least. It's hard for me to place why exactly I feel like that game does such a good job with a no matter what it's depressing ending, and Cyberpunk doesn't, but I'll try. I think maybe it's because Cyberpunk has far more choices, is much longer, and always ends up the same way. Where Spec Ops does have choices, it's much shorter and more on rails. So a lot of the limitations on the ending feel more natural. They don't feel like you've been screwed over with your decision making. It's easier to become Walker because Walker is far more defined, and his actions and conclusions that he draws don't necessarily go against what you want. They feel like logical conclusions to what you did. Where V is definitely a character, but he's supposed to be you, and you have a lot of choice, but ultimately it doesn't feel like you have a lot of choice. It's really only exemplified by the fact so much of the game is in first person. It's so incredibly personal. I also think the ridiculous visual bugs and extremely lackluster final missions and their layout probably didn't help with being immersed in the moment either. Adam Smasher was a cool boss, but he was buggy, and apparently he can be killed in a few hits on lower difficulties. I really do wonder if they were just rushed, or if this was all to set up for a DLC. Sort of like how Blood and Wine is after saving Ciri in the base campaign, assuming Geralt actually survives. Maybe they funneled V into living for only 6 months, so they could make a DLC about that, or him desperately trying to save himself again. But ultimately, all of this is just my opinion, and me rambling, and me talking about my experience with my friends. Not saying I hate the whole game or whole story, quite the opposite. It's just that the conclusion didn't really do anything for me or my friends. It just kind of fizzled out, and I'm really making this video because I feel like those interactions and discussions with my friends that we've had with so many story-driven games in the past were something I loved. But with Cyberpunk, it didn't provide that, at least not for the conclusions or endings. I'm also really curious to hear what other people think. I more than appreciate any comments and discussions, so feel free to post. Again, it's all just my opinion.